Hold on to your seat cheeks. Week 1 of the college football season is now in the bank, and number 2 is coming up. We'll discuss it on the Michael Welch Podcast. The biggest result after week 1 was, of course, the Colorado and TCU game. If you've been hiding under a rock, Deion Sanders said he'd be bringing Louis, and he certainly looks like he has at this point. His son threw for over 500 yards and 4 touchdowns. Former 4-star, or I guess current 4-star prospect Travis Hunter actually did play both sides of the ball, close to 120 snaps, 119 receiving yards, an interception, 3 tackles. He was excellent on both sides of the football. They also had 4 receivers with over 100 yards, and they had 2 receivers with 100-yard games last season, so 4 today. Dylan Edwards, 5 catches for 135 yards and 3 touchdowns, the true freshman. Hunter had 11 grabs to get that 119. Xavier Weaver, 6 catches for 118, and Jimmy Horn Jr., 11 catches for 117 and a touchdown as well. And it just explosive all over the field, explosive on offense. The run game looks like it'll be a little bit questionable. They're only 3-point favorites against Nebraska for this upcoming week, and it does look like the trenches will be a little bit of a problem for them, so they may very much come back down to earth this upcoming week. But TCU has some problems for sure. Chandler Morris threw a couple of big interceptions, 6.6 yards per attempt there, 42 passing attempts when they were having some success on the ground, over 6 yards per carry while they were toting the ball there. And 64 yards for Amani Bailey, so not sure why they went away from the ground game, but that certainly seems problematic along with the turnover problems. But Buffalo looked really good. A lot of people are being told, eating crow, I should say, after not being sure that Deion would make it. I think it's way too early for that. I don't know why he'd be eating crow for anything. They're almost 3 touchdown underdogs in this game, but no one really knew what to expect. And this doesn't really prove anything. TCU is one of 2 teams to fall out of the top 25 altogether in this game, and it shows like they really have some problems and will have difficulties defending on the back end. But this was a 45-42 ball game, and there'll be a lot of those in the Pac-12. The conference as a whole went 13-0 on Saturday. It's the first time I think that's ever happened. So great for that conference. And Deion Sanders, the must-watch ticket right now. Georgia, ranked number 1, crushed UT Martin 48-7. Michigan punched out East Carolina 30-3. Looked a little bit sluggish in the run game initially, but J.J. McCarthy, 280 yards and 3 touchdowns. Ohio State looked very slow. Not sure what the quarterback looks like there. Offensive line didn't look awesome. They had some problems. Ohio State had some problems. Maybe Indiana's back end of the defense looked a little better, and it matched up well with the passing game. But Ohio State wins 23-3. Alabama 56-7 over Middle Tennessee. Jalen Milroe, 194 yards, 3 touchdowns passing, and 48 yards, 2 touchdowns on the ground. But he was the leading rusher, and a lot to prove there. We didn't know he was a starting quarterback till the game started. USC gave up 14 points to Nevada in a 66-14 game point win. Caleb Williams, over 300 yards passing and 5 touchdowns. A little slow at the beginning, 24 points in the fourth helped turn it into a real big blowout. Penn State was slow initially. Drew Aller looks really great though, 325 yards and 3 touchdowns in a 38-15 point win over West Virginia. Now, Utah and Florida was another big game. Utah missing 2 quarterbacks. They hit a big 70-yard passing attempt to kind of open the game up, and they ultimately won this game 24-11. They didn't score any points in the fourth, and Florida was able to put 8, so it was 24-3 heading into the fourth frame there. Just a disgusting game. Florida had 9 penalties, a turnover, averaged less than a yard per rushing attempt, which was supposed to be their strength. 7.6 per pass, which is not great. Utah was 7.2 per pass and 3.5 per rush, which was not awesome, but this was just a disgusting game. Graham Mertz looked awful. He was 31 for 44 for 333 yards, but just looked bad. A touchdown and a pick for him as well. And Florida looked completely inept. And Billy Napier, man, has got to be just on the hot seat. They opened up against a very tough opponent here, obviously on the road, but no one's looking at him like he's a capable coach right now. The defense couldn't get much going at all, and Utah was able to get 5 sacks and 7 tackles for loss, 4 pass breakups is what the accredited number was, and just smashed the Gators in an embarrassing game that people thought maybe Florida goes in there and grabs the win since Utah doesn't have a quarterback, and they were absolutely smoked. Bad showing there. Another game that was supposed to be interesting, Washington hosting Boise State, and Washington puts up 28 points in the second quarter, another 21 late in the fourth to shut them out there, or shut them down, I should say. 56-19 is the final. Michael Penix, 450 yards, 5 touchdowns. I didn't even watch the entire game here. They just splattered Boise State all over the place. Too much throwing for Boise. Taylon Green is not going to be the kind of guy to throw the ball all over the place. They're going to have to run the ball. He was 19 for 39, had 2 picks. Bad ball there. Less than 5 yards per carry, which is not horrible, but they can do a lot of damage in the Mountain West, and that's still certainly possible. But Washington looks just absolutely dangerous as they get multiple quarterbacks in the game here. 5 different guys catch touchdown passes. So a big day for Washington. The defense looking better as well. They only get 1 sack on the day, but they're able to just really completely crush what Boise State was trying to do. Really forced them to throw the ball with the way the offense was able to put them ahead. Boise was 6 for 17 on third down. They had a couple of turnovers. And again, 5.6 yards per pass attempt. Not going to be their strength, but Washington just did a good job of completely flattening them out. And this is a defense that gave up a lot of points last year. They look much better this season. Texas, I didn't watch a ton of this game, but they were a little sluggish. 37-10 over Rice was the final. The halftime score was 16-3. They've got Alabama coming up here. Ewers had 260 yards, 3 touchdowns, and Rice is just not a team that you should be that close with. Not great. Not great at all. 4.1 yards per carry. A couple guys had a little bit higher average than there. A couple sacks brought it down, but still, that's not awesome at all. They got a couple sacks on the day, a few tackles for losses, but also the offensive line gave up a few. Just not super great there for Texas. Virginia got completely blown out by Tennessee, 49-13. Don't worry, they got the cover there. Joe Milton had 2 touchdowns in the air and 2 touchdowns rushing. 21 for 30 passing, though, against a really bad Virginia team. Took an easy game this week, but we'll see. We'll see about that. Notre Dame crushes Tennessee State 56-3. A couple more touchdowns for Sam Hartman there. Oregon wins 81-7 over Portland State in their opener. Has the stats all over the place. 45-0. Kansas State over Southeast Missouri as they look okay in their debut. Not a lot to see there. 28 points in the second quarter before they let off. And Wisconsin slamming Buffalo 38-17. The scoring burst really comes in the second half of that game. Tanner Mordecai did not look awesome. He was 24 for 31 for 189 yards, a touchdown and 2 picks. But the ground game, 314 yards. Ches Miluzzi had 2 touchdowns and 157 yards. And of course, Braylon Edwards, 141 and 2 touchdowns as well. So a great ground game while Mordecai finds his feet there for the Wisconsin offense. The defense, not able to get any sacks on Buffalo, which is slightly concerning. We'll just have to see what that team does moving forward. Now, Oklahoma crushes Arkansas State 73-0. Didn't really expect that from this team. Dylan Gabriel, great numbers, 308 yards, 2 touchdowns, 19 for 22. Jackson Arnold's been sitting in the wings. He was 11 for 11 for 114 yards and a touchdown. There's already thoughts that he should be stepping in to the quarterback position. 39 yards and a touchdown on the ground as well. Great game for him. The defense held the Red Wolves to 2 for 12 on third down. Of course, Red Wolves also had 14 penalties and a turnover, so that wasn't great for them. 2.1 yards per rush, 5.9 per pass attempt, so maybe the defense is finally looking up for Oklahoma. Texas A&M smoked New Mexico 52-10. Wingman had 5 touchdowns in this game, so maybe Texas A&M finally looking up as well. Ole Miss 73-7 over Mercer, 4 touchdowns and over 300 yards for Jackson Dart. Judkins, the sophomore, only 60 yards, but a couple touchdowns there. Tulane has no problem with South Alabama. 37-17 is the final. 24-10 at half. Pratt has 4 touchdowns, over almost 251 yards of offense, I believe it was, passing. 5 sacks by the defense, and they forced 5 turnovers. They just blew out the South Alabama Jaguars in a game that was supposed to be pretty darn close. Iowa 24-10 over Utah State. They were able to put a few points on the board. They were short of their 25-point quota, though, so they'll have to make that up at some point on the way. But they were able to beat the Utah Aggies there. McNamara did play. He was 17 for 30 for 191 and 2 touchdowns. Run game didn't get a lot going. The defense didn't put up a lot of impressive numbers, but they were able to mask up the Aggies there pretty good. Forced a turnover. They had 10 penalties. They covered up the pass game, less than 5 yards per passing attempt, 4.8 per rush, and Iowa only 2.4 per rush. So they'll have to get a little bit better there. And they actually fell out of the top 25. Oregon State drops San Jose State 42-17 as DJ Uiagalelei looks pretty comfortable there. 3 touchdowns. Martinez, 145 yards of rushing, so it looks like they may have a great duo there. And they did a pretty good job on San Jose State, who scores 2 touchdowns late in the 4th to keep some points on there, to keep it somewhat respectable. And our 3 kind of bigger games here, North Carolina and South Carolina. South Carolina looks absolutely atrocious. They had negative rush yardage after you take out sacks and everything like that. They were sacked 9 times. North Carolina outside 16 tackles for losses. North Carolina only had 17 sacks all of last season, so South Carolina making them look great. Drake May had a couple of interceptions, which didn't look great, but he was also 24 for 32 for 269 yards and 2 touchdowns. He didn't have to run as much. His top 2 receivers expected were out, I believe. I think one of them had an injury. One of them might not play at all this year if his waiver isn't cleared, his transfer waiver, which would be terribly unfortunate. So he may have to make do with who he was thrown to. Kobe Paysauer at 7 catches for 66 yards and a touchdown. John Copenhaver at 3 for 52 and a touch. So he's got some choices there, certainly. And a real running back. He's not going to lead the team rushing this year. British Brooks had 15 carries for 103 yards. That's 6.9 per carry. And Omarion Hampton had 2 touchdowns as well. So it looks good from the offensive side of things for the most part. And the defense looking to come along after it's been just horrible for so long. Spencer Rattler, was 30 for 39, 353 yards. Couldn't get it done, though. Again, negative rushing yards. One running back was 12 for 23 carrying. That's 1.9 and a touchdown. But it was just bad all over the place. The defense was not good. And South Carolina looks like it's going to have some real problems. But 31-17 was the final of this ball game. We move on to Florida State and LSU. And boy, oh boy, some of LSU's corners looked very, very small. A lot of transfers back there, but still, they couldn't stop the big bodies that Florida State had flying down there. Keon Coleman from Michigan State, 9 catches for 122 yards and 3 touchdowns. Johnny Wilson had like 3 drops in this game. It was sloppy for a long time. 7 grabs for 104, and he could have had even more. Just wild. Penalties, a lot of bad penalties early. 2 4th down stops. LSU couldn't get it in the red zone down there, so they had problems early. And at times, Jordan Travis just didn't want to throw the ball downfield. Jaden Daniels sometimes looks like he can't throw the ball downfield. But Daniels finishes 22 for 37 passing, 347 yards, which looks good. A touchdown and a pick, but the touchdown didn't come until the 4th quarter. He had 64 yards on the ground, and that was a good chunk of their running game right there, so they couldn't get a lot going. Florida had a hard time stopping the defensive line there. In particular, Wingo on that defensive line was causing them a lot of problems. I saw it noted that Harold Perkins was actually not as involved in the game plan as they thought, and that was kind of Not great from LSU's perspective that he wasn't as involved in sacks and stuff like that. But Florida State did a great job, ultimately, despite not throwing the ball as much as they should be, pushing it downfield, despite some of the despite having 5 penalties to none for LSU at one point, despite the turnovers, and LSU ultimately really just fell apart. They ended up 3 for 10 on third down versus 9 for 14 for Florida State. And Florida State, the ceiling is the roof, or the roof is the ceiling, as they say. They could possibly make a playoff run after a big win like this. They do have to play at Clemson in just a couple weeks here, so we may know how far they can go. Speaking of Clemson, they got completely eviscerated on Labor Day, 28-7 by Duke. They had 2 turnovers in the red zone, 2 fumbles. They had 2 missed field goals. They wouldn't pass the ball past the line of scrimmage with the new offensive coordinator in place there, Garrett Riley, the brother of Lincoln Riley. They had all kinds of problems. Klubnik was 27 for 43 for 209 yards. That's 4.9 per passing attempt. A touchdown, a pick, 34 yards on 12 carries. But again, the fumbles, man. The fumbles were horrible. 3 total, 2 lost. And Will Shipley, who again, I stated was underutilized, 17 carries for 114 yards. That's 6.7 per attempt. He also had 6 catches for 29 yards and a touchdown. And Phil Maffa, 11 carries for 65 yards, 2 receptions for 14 yards as his complement out of the backfield, although he had a fumble as well. But those are the 2 most dangerous guys on the field. Antonio Williams at receiver, 7 grabs for 56. Not super scary. Collins, 5 for 50. Clemson was supposed to have one of the best defenses in the country, in part because each individual level is top 5. But man, Duke, despite terrible offensive numbers and having to really push the ball on turnovers, which is not a replicable stat necessarily, they were able to tear apart Clemson when they needed to. Find the passes down the field and push on the front 7. 0 sacks for Clemson. They did force Riley Lincoln out of the pocket several times, but did not sack the guy. He did scramble for a touchdown. They only had 1 penalty. That's a positive. 7 for Duke, but just a terrible job at managing the offense. They were 7 for 15 on third down. They had 422 yards. Duke had 374. It was 5 for 15 on third down. Offensively, they were worse, and yet Duke still got the push when they needed to. And of course, the turnover margin was only 1. There's only 1 difference there. Duke still had a couple of their own, and they had completely eviscerated. This looks like a very sad football team right now, and they could lose games. Florida State's coming to town, of course. They play at Miami, at NC State, home against Notre Dame, home against North Carolina. I don't know, man. They look bad. They look really bad. All right, I'm still recovering from my respiratory issue a little bit, so we may speed through this section just a touch. It is a big slate this upcoming week, and we're a little light on the weekday games here, but when you're watching the opening night of the NFL slate on Thursday with the Kansas City Chiefs and the Detroit Lions, which will be a little light with Travis Kelce out. We have some other injuries there as well for Frank Clark out, holding out for the Kansas City Chiefs as well. We'll see if the Detroit Lions can win on the road. That line has moved all the way down from like 7.5 to 4.5 at this moment. So big game there. But the college game on Thursday will be Louisville hosting Murray State on the ACC network at 7:30. It'll be roasty toasty in Louisville, Kentucky, right around 90 degrees right now. It'll be the second outing for Jake Plummer there at quarterback for Louisville. He finished with 3 touchdowns, 247 yards last week against Georgia Tech. Now, again, they were down big at the half against GT there. They were able to rally in the second half and grab a big win. They've been criticized a little bit this past week. Again, the roster isn't elite. The schedule, though, a little bit soft, and I think they did a lot by coming back against Georgia Tech. Not that that's a great measuring stick there. But Jake Plummer, graded out by PFF as a really good college quarterback last year on a miserable California team. Great coach here on the coaching change for Louisville, hosting Murray State on the ACC Network, 7:30 on Thursday. You only got 2 games on Friday. Indiana hosting Indiana State on the Big Ten Network at 7 o'clock. Indiana, of course, the secondary, able to slow down Ohio State a little bit last week. They'll have a chance for a win here. And 7:30, ESPN2, man. Kansas will be hosting Illinois. This is a 3-point line on this game. The late scratch, Jalen Daniels for Kansas last week. A little bit of a shocker against Missouri State, I believe it was. Not Montana State. Missouri State, they struggled in the game for the first half until Jason Bean pulled them out. I'm not sure that he's a huge drop-off at the quarterback position. Jalen Daniels, certainly a more dynamic playmaker, though. It'd be nice to have him back. Their defense is still abhorrent. Illinois had its own problems against Toledo, who did win the MAC last year, but Illinois had to kick a field goal to pull out that game 30-28. Luke Altmaier, the Ole Miss transfers in there. Not great quarterback play, not great secondary play as far as I could tell. Not great receiver play outside of Pat Bryant, who had a couple touchdowns, but not a lot of excitement there. Big downgrades to Illinois, who had great success last year. Regardless of who actually plays, this should still be a fun game between 2 Power 5s, standalone there in the 7:30 slot on Friday night. And again, there's not a whole lot going on in the weekday slots at all. So let's move right on to the noon slate. Only 12 games this Saturday in the noon window on the 9th. And the night slate is going to be packed. But let's touch on an 11 a.m. kickoff on the ACC Network. Wake Forest will be hosting Vanderbilt. Both teams undefeated so far. Wake a big favorite at home by 10 points. Now, Swan does have 5 touchdowns, 1 pick. 450 yards passing for Vanderbilt, who's pulled out a couple of wins so far this season, of course, scraping by Hawaii there, and then beating Alabama A&M last week, while Wake Forest with Mitch Giffis, who I believe is from Central Florida, could be wrong on that, wasn't super impressive, but had 3 touchdowns and 300 yards against Elon, and somehow this is a Power 5 matchup. Again, this slides in early at 11 a.m. on the ACC Network, so you can certainly check out that ball game. Georgia, Ohio State, Penn State are all hosting cupcakes. The Big Ten Network will have number 5 Ohio State hosting Youngstown State. We'll see if Kyle McCord plays any better and no touchdowns in his debut. If the offensive line plays any better. Of course, we'll see more quarterbacks, presumably in the mix, as this will be a big blowout. It's not necessarily true that McCord has that spot completely locked down. It's a little scary there on the offensive end for Ohio State, even if the defense looks excellent. On Peacock, of course, they stole the Michigan game last week. Now they're stealing number 7 Penn State. They moved up to 7 in the polls there. They're hosting Delaware, so we'll get to see Drew Aller back in the mix there for the Nittany Lions, who struggled just a touch with West Virginia again before he was able to get things moving. I'd like to see a little bit more from their offensive line, so he doesn't necessarily have to wiggle and roll as much. And Georgia, again, not great quarterback play from their new starter either in Carson Beck. Touchdown, almost 300 yards, but they'll be hosting Ball State on the SEC Network. They're 42-point favorites. James Madison moved up to the FCS level last year and had great success right off the bat, and now they're almost a touchdown favorite on the road at Power 5 school Virginia on ESPNU. That shows you how far in the hole Virginia is right now, but the James Madison Dukes will be favored against a Power 5 school on the road. Purdue and Virginia Tech will be battling on ESPN2 in trying to see which team can possibly make a bowl game, quite frankly. Purdue lost to Fresno State, of course, 39-35. Virginia Tech was able to fend off Old Dominion 36-17. They have problems with that game. Grant Wells, the once Marshall quarterback, threw 3 touchdown passes there. That was a big win. So it's possible that Virginia Tech could get off to a nice 2-0 start here and have Rutgers on deck and then Marshall his former team there before they play Pitt and Florida State. So it's possible we could have a 4-0 Virginia Tech team to start off the season here. So those are a couple of the notable games. Now the watchable games, one worth flicking to, I believe, is Troy and Kansas State doing battle over on FS1. Troy is hosting. Neither team played good competition last week and both won pretty handily. Gunnar Watson is a good quarterback looking there for Troy. 4 touchdowns last week, less than 200 yards, but they did a good job on the ground. Kamir Vittel had 248 yards, and they have a good running back group there that put over 300 yards on the board. I'm not sure the defense can do much, if anything, to really prevent what the Wildcats want to do. They had over 200 yards on the ground as well. DJ Giddens was the best back with 128 yards on 15 carries, taking over for Deuce Vaughn. Will Howard, of course, 297 yards, 18 for 26 passing, almost 70%, a couple touchdowns and a pick. He also scrambled for just 5 yards. So we'll see. The Wildcats not doing too much against, I believe it was Southeastern, some directional school. This will be a much tougher game for them. They're still favored by close to 16 points is the spread. We might see Will Howard throwing it and possibly running it a little bit more in this game. Now, some of your top watches. Now, ESPN's going to have Baylor and Utah, who's ranked 14th. They'll be playing at Waco. And this is an unfortunate game with quarterback injuries. Blake Shapen went down for Baylor last week, but they still lost to Texas State. They were suffering even when he was on the field. He had 300 yards before he went down, and Baylor just looks real bad. They look real bad. Would have been better, of course, if they won their opener and looked a little better there. Utah, of course, beat a very bad Florida team. Kind of hard to gauge where exactly they're at. Cam Rising is not necessarily expected back for this one. I don't think he is. Backup quarterback, I believe, is still out, so they're going to be down to their third, fourth stringers who played in the previous game there against Florida. And they certainly managed the game. They didn't have any turnovers, but they didn't do much on offense, particularly in the second half. They really just took advantage of what Florida gave to them, which was a whole lot. Bryson Barnes was 12 for 18 for 159 and a touchdown. He ran one in as well, but just not a whole lot there. Nate Johnson was 3 for 4 passing at 45 rushing yards and a touchdown. But again, it was the ground game, not the passing game, that really did a lot for them. And 70 of Bryson Barnes' passing yards came on one big attempt. I believe was the very first play of the game that went for a touchdown. So that inflates a lot. And they had fewer offensive yards than the Florida Gators, less than 300 yards of total offense. So this is still a marquee game, but Utah's favored by almost 8 on the road to still slice and dice Baylor. It could get a little rough to watch, but this is still higher compared to what we've got going on here. 2 more marquee games. Now, NC State's on ABC. They're hosting Notre Dame. The Irish are now 2-0. Hartman had another few touchdowns last week, beating nobody. And NC State, their offense just looks gross. It looks gross. Brennan Armstrong struggled again. A second year where you expect a quarterback to do a good job kind of guiding that offense. And they couldn't do much at all last week against Connecticut in a 24-14 win on the road. Armstrong was 17 for 26 for 155. That's a 65% completion percentage, no touchdowns, no turnovers, 19 carries for 96 yards. He can scoot his boot, but just was not good at all. 200 yards rushing is what the grand total came out to. Defense looked fine. Breaking up passes, had a pick, had a couple sacks there, but it's just a struggle to watch. And Notre Dame's starting to fire on all cylinders here, and the Irish are favored by over a touchdown now on the road. That is rough for NC State's opener there, but that is on ABC. Get a look at Notre Dame. They might make the playoffs, dark horse playoff team at this particular point. And finally, Colorado home opener hosting Nebraska on Fox. Now, they're only favored by a field goal. They're not particularly physical in the trenches. Nebraska didn't look awesome against Minnesota, but that may be an area that they excel. TCU, perhaps if they'd done a little more pushing, would have done a little bit better rather than air it out 40 times. That would have been a little bit more productive for them. And now Colorado has laid a game plan a little bit here, and Matt Rule now will have the opportunity to take advantage of him. His transfer quarterback out of Georgia Tech, Sims, had 2 or 3 interceptions against Minnesota and really struggled, but they can move the ball a little bit. This will be an interesting game to see what Colorado can do game 2 with all these pieces. What kind of numbers will we get? How many snaps will Hunter play? Will they be able to run the ball? How will the defense do? Will they give up another 40 points? I don't know if Nebraska can put up 40 points right now, but those are kind of your top watches in the noonish window Eastern time. Colorado hosting Nebraska on Fox, Baylor hosting Utah on ESPN, and NC State hosting Notre Dame on ABC. Now the afternoon slate almost doubles in games. We have 22 options. The ones to know about: Michigan, Clemson, Kentucky, BYU, Michigan State, Arkansas will all play inferior competition. We have Clemson, who's knocked all the way down to 25th ranked. They've got a 2:15 on the ACC network hosting Charleston Southern. Maybe they'll get that defense going a little bit, or offense, or really both, after that embarrassing Duke loss there. Kentucky will be hosting Eastern Kentucky at 3 o'clock on ESPN+. Also on ESPN Plus on the Big 12 Network at 3 will be BYU hosting Southern Utah. Not a lot to see from them. Neither team has really played. Kentucky or BYU has played much in their opener. Kentucky was able to take on Ball State and win that one 44-14. Not a whole lot to see there. Of course, the offensive line seems to be better than it was last year, which was one of the worst in the entire country. They've got a new quarterback there by the name of Devin Leary, transferring in from NC State. Was not super impressive. 58% completion percentage, a touchdown, a pick. Tough roll there. But again, not a great competition. And BYU beat Sam Houston 14-0 behind quarterback Keldon Slavic on his third school in 3 or 4 years. And no touchdowns, no picks, 20 for 33. And the defense pitched a shutout. So there's that. Michigan will be on at 3:30 on the CBS network, prime time, hosting UNLV. Running Rebels almost made a bowl game last year, as did the East Carolina Pirates, who Michigan crushed on week 1. Did take them a minute to get going, though. J.J. McCarthy, 3 touchdowns. But the run game, a touch behind there. Expect them to go to the ground a lot and run through UNLV. And then Michigan State will be hosting Richmond on the Big Ten Network at 3:30 as well. Took them a second to get going to beat Central Michigan 31-7. Took them a minute to get started against Central Michigan last season. Noah Kim, 18 for 31, 279 and 2 touchdowns, was the starting quarterback. Looked pretty bad at first. Closed with a really nice completion percentage in the second half. And Arkansas crushed West Carolina, and they'll be playing Kent State. Honestly, I didn't watch a second of this game. I see KJ Jefferson completed 78% of his passes, 3 touchdowns, 246 yards. Didn't do much on the ground. Didn't do much at all on the ground, about 100 yards. A little interesting there. And the defense did have a couple sacks, couple passes broken up. But again, we're not going to learn much through 2 weeks from the Arkansas Razorbacks. There is a smaller game going on here. UTSA did have a tough loss to Texas this past week. They'll be on ESPN Plus, hosting that feisty Texas State team that just took down Baylor. That could be just an interesting little back and forth there. Texas State running an interesting offense, and that'll be on, again, ESPN Plus, about a 2-touchdown favorite, UTSA. Now, in the afternoon slot, we do have 2 watchable games, I think, and one that'll be good to flip over to. Iowa State beat Northern Iowa last week. Not an awesome performance through the air. Rocco Becht was 10 for 13 for 113 yards and a couple touchdowns at quarterback. J.J. Cole came in as well. He was 4 for 5 for 3 whopping yards. Not a lot from the quarterback position. Not a lot from the offense as well. 134 yards on the ground, spread around a little bit there. The defense looked strong again. They had 5 sacks. And Iowa, of course, will be playing a lot of defense, as we're familiar with as well. Now, they did not hit 25 points last week. 25 points and 7 wins, I believe, is the number in order for Ferentz' son, the offensive coordinator there, to keep his job. And they did not hit that number last week, so they'll have to make it up somewhere. but it won't be in this game. Cade McNamara did, however, have 191 yards and 2 touchdowns. Big numbers there, although they weren't particularly impressive, and knocking off a not-so-great team there in Utah State, 24-14. So even the defense didn't pitch a no-hitter, as they have previously against inferior competition. But Iowa State, that game will be on Fox, 3:30 on Saturday. The 2 good games on the slate will be Tulane hosting Ole Miss on ESPN2 and Miami hosting Texas A&M on ABC. Both are slotted for 3:30. Tulane had no problem smashing South Alabama last week. Defense looked good. They'll get after Ole Miss's offensive line there, and they'll be trying to push around to open up lanes for that run game. And Judkins, the superstar running back, Jackson Dart had a great game, even throwing the ball last week against Mercer, which is not something they typically want to do. That will be a great battle right there between Tulane and Ole Miss. Let's see, they were 24th and 23rd last week. Their rankings right now, as of the new AP poll, which only had a couple teams fall out and a couple teams sliding around because those 2 teams dropped. And their rankings right now are 24th and 20th. So we didn't see a whole lot of changing there. Ole Miss is favored by 7.5 on the road. 67-point over-under seems like a lot. But again, Tulane put up quite a few points last week and really showed that they're not just a defensive team, probably, in beating up South Alabama. Jackson Dart had 334 yards passing last week and 4 touchdowns. That's just not something he did at all last season. That's going to be one of the better games on the slate, and the slate is loaded. Now, Miami and Texas A&M was garbage last season. It was bad. You watched the game, you came out and you said, are both of these teams a little questionable on offense, or is something going on here? And it turned out they were both pretty wicked awful. Connor Wingman, very good last week, 5 touchdowns in smashing an inferior opponent. Miami, same thing, didn't learn a whole lot, although they didn't look super great, and they're hosting here. And the line is 4 points, Texas A&M's way as of right now. Miami beat Miami of Ohio 38-3. They rolled up almost 500 yards of offense, and they did rush for 6.9 per carry, 9.7 per pass, but they did have 8 penalties. They had a turnover and did not force a turnover. On the flip side, for Miami of Ohio, Van Dyke had 1 touchdown and 1 pick. He was 17 for 22 for 201, which is fine. Emory Williams, the backup, came in and was 3 for 3 passing. They did roll up 250 yards on the ground. I'm not sure if that's going to translate to Texas A&M, who should have one of the best defensive lines in the country, in part because of that recruiting talent that they brought in last season, finally maturing, some sophomores on the line there, and a good group up front. And again, Connor Wingman, is he going to do some damage to that secondary? It's supposed to be improved. Of course, no one will get out of their head what Middle Tennessee did in week 2 or 3. I think it was week 2 last week. Just how many points they put on the board in a blowout of Miami at their place. So we'll see. Texas A&M could do a lot of damage here. Miami would look great if they pulled the upset, quite frankly. That's what it would be. Not unranked Miami and 23rd ranked Texas A&M. I think that's got to be number 1 on the docket, but Ole Miss Tulane definitely right up there. Tulane hoping to win the American Conference and make it to a New Year's 6 bowl game. Now, the evening slate on Saturday is absolutely wild. I counted 42 games, but I had to use my fingers and toes twice, so my math might be a little off. But more games in the evening slate than the rest of the day combined. Half of your ranked teams are playing in the evening slate, but you have one crown jewel. You have a top game. You have a good second game to check in on. I sorted like 9 games into my possible channel flippers, and I've got about a dozen other teams playing games as well. So let's just start at the top. It was an afternoon game last year. It came down to a field goal. It's been long awaited, home and home, since the series was announced. And Texas came up just short last year. Its top quarterback was out, and it still hung in tight. Took a lead with a couple minutes left and ultimately lost it to Alabama, the Crimson Tide, and caused questions about whether they would be winning the national championship. this time it's in Tuscaloosa. Texas will be traveling. It's ESPN at 7:30 in the evening, the big game. And, boy, Quentin Ewers struggled. I wouldn't say struggled. The offensive line struggled a little bit last week. Texas was a little sluggish, beating Rice. Didn't look awesome. Alabama. Jade Milrose is the starter, at least we know that now. He looked very good, scrambling, throwing. But these teams aren't quite what we'd consider national championship contenders right now. But this is still a big game because they could both get to that spot. Alabama might have the best defense in the country. Several teams can lay stake to that right now, but Alabama might be up there. They might be the best. Can they put a lot of pressure on the offensive line of Texas? Can they cause a lot of questions for Quentin Ewers in throwing the ball? His receiving core didn't exactly explode on Rice last week, although they could cause problems for Alabama, who's got some secondary issues. One or two guys might be out for this ball game. That wouldn't be ideal. Quarterback position, again, Quentin Ewers, lots of hype coming into this season. I'm still not sure that starting position is completely locked up if he has problems early. And Alabama might play other guys if Jaden Milrose struggles. So this is just a mammoth football game, 7 o'clock ESPN. This is the top watch of the entire week. Now, Fox will have Oregon heading to Lubbock, Texas to play Texas Tech, the Red Raiders. Now, Texas Tech, a lot of speculation that they could win the Big 12 this year in their own right, possibly bumping out Texas or playing Texas. They had problems last week, as in they were up 17 points against Wyoming and lost the game. Not great. Tyler Shuck is there, and he'll be taking on his former school in the Ducks. 338 yards last week, 3 touchdowns and a pick. The defensive line gave up 3 sacks. They rushed for under 100 yards. The defense got after Wyoming pretty good in general. Oregon smashed Portland. There's a lot of talk about how good they looked, even though they played an inferior opponent. However, new offensive line and a lot of speculation that it's going to be a good group. We'll see if Texas Tech can put pressure on Bo Nix, who had 3 touchdowns, completed 85% of his passes last week before getting pulled because of the massive blowout. We'll also see if Oregon's secondary can hold up if Texas Tech continues to struggle running the football. Again, Oregon's defense is going to have to really step up if they hope to win the Pac-12, because it looks like a few other units may be making strides in that direction as well. And they're favored by less than a touchdown now. Oregon is on the road. This would have been a much bigger game if Texas Tech did not lose last week, but this is still a big one on Fox. Oregon currently ranked 13th, playing at Texas Tech. Those are kind of the 2 top watches that I have on the radar. Other games on the slate, so let's start at the earliest one here. Appalachian State at North Carolina on the ACC network at 5:15. Why is this big? Because this was a shootout last year. I think we had like 60 points in the fourth quarter. No, 60 combined points in the fourth quarter. This was wild. North Carolina's defense looks much better this season, but Appalachian State looks like they can also play ball this year after struggling after the close loss to North Carolina last season. This could be an excellent game still. North Carolina hosting Appalachian State. ACC Network at 5:15 as we're exiting the back end of the afternoon slate. Take a peek at that. North Carolina could certainly shoot up the rankings, not from this win, but after the production we saw against South Carolina with that defensive front being much better. 6 o'clock, squirreled away on stupid ESPN+. Oklahoma will be hosting SMU. Again, we expect a lot of points from a game like this. Oklahoma crushed Arkansas State, who's supposed to be a pretty decent Power 5 team there with Butch Jones, former Power 5 coach at the helm there, and they beat the hell out of them last week. Will that continue? We might have a bit of a quarterback battle there, as in we have 2 good options, so that'll be a great game to see what happens there. Oklahoma hosting SMU, ESPN Plus at 7 o'clock. Coastal Carolina hosting Jacksonville State. I guess I slipped this one in on myself, but the Chanticleers played a good game for about 3 quarters against UCLA last week. Part of that was a number of turnovers by the starting quarterback there, But the Chanticleers still have a good quarterback with Grayson McCall there. The defense can do a couple things. Jacksonville State's off to a 2-0 start to its season. This is just a small little non-Power 5 matchup between two okay teams with a good quarterback there in Grayson McCall. Just a little something that's going to get buried and lost in the news, but they'll be on. 6:30 does have Pitt hosting Cincinnati on the CW network, if you happen to float by in that direction. 7 o'clock, Boise State will be hosting Central Florida on FS1. No longer a Power 5, non-Power 5 matchup, but a Mountain West team hosting a Big 12 team. Central Florida looked really good last week. They smashed Kent State 56-6, and Kent State's supposed to be one of the worst teams in Division I this year, with a good chunk of their roster hitting the transfer portal, but still. Plumlee, 281 yards passing, 73% completion percentage, 3 touchdowns. He did have a couple picks in there. Another 90 yards on the ground and a touchdown. 389 yards overall on the ground. 3 sacks, a couple batted passes, a pick. They looked really good in shredding exactly what they should do, beating a not very good football team. But they sure looked like they're fully operational on both sides of the football. Boise State needs to get back to the ground game with their quarterback there, Taylor Green, which is exactly what Plumlee on the Central Florida side is going to do. Could be very interesting having a couple dual threat quarterbacks, although I say that a little sparingly as both struggle to throw a little bit. But that could be a fun game there on FS1 at 7 o'clock. 7:30, I have a quartet of games down. Washington State will be hosting Wisconsin on ABC, a home and home here. Remember, Washington State with Incarnate Word Cameron Ward quarterback transferring up a division and over a school and flying across country and beating Wisconsin last year. And now Wisconsin, a little reboot here, new coaching staff, new quarterback. Mordecai did not play well last week, and now he's flying across the country to play what should be a pretty good defense on ABC, and they got a win in their place now. Wisconsin, supposed to be a really good contender there in the Big Ten West Division, and now they have to go play a team that's not getting a lot of publicity because of all the powerhouses, the top half of the Pac-12 right now, but this will be a good game. Mississippi State will be hosting Arizona on the SEC network. Again, Arizona looking good, getting that passing game rolling again in Mississippi State with a new group there. They both won their openers there. Mississippi State favored by 9 at home. I should say Wisconsin's favored by 6 on the road. Mississippi State is favored by 9 points here. The defense reloading group here. Lots of upperclassmen, though. They could be a sneaky team if they win enough games. This is the SEC East, then, I believe. Whatever division they're in there. Same as Alabama, LSU, and Ole Miss, which could be dangerous. But a lot of upperclassmen here, and they could be a very good group if they get things rolling, and they have so far this season. Jane DeLora had 3 touchdowns, 285 in the opener for Arizona. Also, I put this one down. Minnesota's hosting Eastern Michigan. Minnesota looked bad against Nebraska. They're favored by 20.5 points against Eastern Michigan on the Big Ten Network. Now, Eastern Michigan was up big on Howard, slowly let them creep into the game, had to survive 33-23. But this team's been pretty decent by Eastern Michigan standards recently. They went to a bowl game last year. Austin Smith was 19 for 28 for 175, a touchdown and a pick, which is not impressive at all. Ground game wasn't very good. Defense had 4 sacks and did some things last week. But I put that down. Minnesota hosting Eastern Michigan on the Big Ten Network at 7:30. And finally, CBS will be hosting an interesting game because we've got 2 West Coast teams on the tube. San Diego State out of the Mountain West will be hosting UCLA out of the Pac-12. Just kind of a weird combination. And just a weird setup there, but with all the shifting landscape and teams and conferences, it'll be something we're familiar with soon, but kind of a weird game for them to have. Nevertheless, San Diego State has been horrific on offense. They beat Ohio week 0, 20-13, and Ohio didn't have their quarterback. They struggled with Idaho State 36-26. they might not be great on or very good on either side of the football, despite the fact that they're 2-0. And UCLA, once they made a quarterback change to Dante Moore, they were able to be a lot more productive. Ethan Garbers was 10 for 17 for 121, a touchdown and 2 picks, which were kind of off. At least one was off a tipped ball. I think they both were. In the, the broadcasting crew just wanted him back in the game. It's not his fault. Now, at some point, you really need to not have your balls fumbled and end up in other people's hands. So Dante Moore came in, 2 touchdown passes in like half a dozen plays and was quite successful. He also had a pick. He finished 7 for 12, so he had his struggles as well. But he'll be the starter moving forward, I would imagine, because he was so much more productive than Ethan Garbers, who was certainly looking over his shoulder all night. And the Bruins will have some work to do with Dante Moore working in. Again, the defense doing pretty well, especially in the fourth quarter and the second half of that football game against Coastal Carolina. But just not looking as potent offensively as some of the teams in the Pac-12. However, they have the best schedule, really. They do have to play Utah, Oregon State, and USC on the road, but they dodge Washington, they dodge Oregon. Out of all the best teams there, which are there like 6 of them, they miss some of the top teams, so they do have to play them on the road. But they get Utah early here in a couple weeks. Will Cam Rising be healthy? That's a big question. They do get Colorado at home. We'll see how that goes for Colorado there. UCLA should still be a favorite in that one as far as we've seen so far. So they have a workable schedule here to do some damage and put up some wins on the board if they can settle some things here. But that's a whole nice middle segment of games there. North Carolina hosting App State, Oklahoma hosting SMU, Pitt hosting Cincy, Coastal Carolina hosting Jacksonville State, Boise State hosting UCF, Washington State hosting Wisconsin, Mississippi State hosting Arizona, Minnesota hosting Eastern Michigan, San Diego State hosting UCLA, on top of Texas Tech hosting Oregon and Alabama hosting Texas, all in your evening slate. We also have Washington will be hosting Tulsa on the Pac-12 network at 5 o'clock. They're heavy favorites there, but that is their time slot. Tennessee will be hosting Austin Peay at 5 o'clock as well on the ESPN Plus network. LSU will be on trying to rebound after their embarrassing opener, getting spanked by Florida State. They'll be hosting Grambling at 7:30 on ESPN Plus and SEC Network Plus. Duke is now ranked. They're 21st. They slid in. They're one of the new teams in there. The only teams that slid out of the top 25 this week were Iowa and somebody else, but Iowa was one of them. Again, only a couple bigger upsets there, so only 2 teams slid out. Colorado and Duke moved in. It was Iowa and TCU. TCU also slid out as well. And then, Ohio State actually dropped a couple slots as Florida State and Alabama moved up. LSU and Clemson took a tumble. So hopefully week 2 we'll see some upsets. Week 3 we'll see some shakeup. We're certainly set for that. But Duke will be hosting Lafayette at 6 o'clock on ESPN Plus. We also have Florida, Maryland, South Carolina, TCU all in action. Florida State will be hosting Southern Miss on the ACC network at 8:30. But again, a lot of these teams just heavy favorites here in the evening slate. Moving on to the late night, we have a half dozen games, and we have certainly some interesting ones. Oregon State, Fresno State, and USC will all be on the docket. 9 o'clock, Oregon State, ranked 16th, will be hosting UC Davis. That'll be squirreled away on the Pac-12 network. Now, DJ Uiagalelei did look very good in his debut against the Spartans of San Jose State last week, and we hope to see that again because that'll make them a true contender. Again, this is a team that was just missing really a quarterback last year as a key piece to make them a competitor in the Pac-12, and they're right in the mix now that they have that. Fresno State does not have a network declared that I see. They're hosting Eastern Washington at 9 o'clock. Again, they beat Purdue last week, 366 and 4 touchdowns for Mikey Keene. Brooks, 9 catches for 170 yards and 2 touchdowns. Fox at 10:30, ESPN at 10:30, and I guess I don't have a network for Arizona State, Oklahoma State, but let's start there. The Sun Devils struggled last week against Southern Utah. They had a delay, and then they started playing, and then they had another delay, and they didn't finish till about 4 a.m. Eastern time, I believe was the what I heard there. It'll be 100 degrees in Tempe as they welcome Oklahoma State. The Fighting Mike Gundays are coming to town. They're 3-point favorites and should be that at least. Rashada had 236 and 2 touchdowns in his debut as a true freshman quarterback for the Sun Devils, and they really struggled in this football game last week. But it's a new coaching staff and a rebuilding project there, and a non-Power 5 matchup in the late night. It's not something you typically see. Oklahoma State trying to hang in the Big 12. They weren't exactly impressive against Central Arkansas last week, winning 27-13. Not exactly what you'd call impressive. New quarterback there, Garrett Regal, 10 for 15, 118, a touchdown and a pick. Questions. Didn't watch a lot, or any of this one really. Questions there for Oklahoma State, so maybe Arizona State can sneak up and get them. So let's head to USC. Almost 30-point favorites against Stanford, but this will be on Fox. Caleb Williams already up to 597 yards passing and 9 touchdowns on the season. Big numbers, certainly in his future. They're 2-0. They played week 0 already, so they knocked the game out. 56 points and 66 points against San Jose State and Nevada, respectively. The defense giving up 28 and 14 points to those offenses. Still questions there. Can they stop a decent football team? Stanford does not qualify as a decent football team. Again, a 30-point spread is absolutely insane. Stanford beat Hawaii 37-24 last week. They might have a quarterback in Ashton Daniels. Completed almost 70% of his passes for 2 touchdowns. But man, it's going to be rough sledding. We'll see if they can put up points on USC there, though. And we have another Power 5 matchup. Auburn at Cal. This is the ESPN game. Auburn's favored by almost a touchdown, but Cal did some damage last week. They didn't exactly play a great opponent in North Texas. Not a bad opponent. They can do some damage. They were one of the better offenses in the country last year, and they did go play at Texas, in Texas. 58-21 was the final. They put up 322 yards through the air, although it wasn't exactly the most impressive performance. 347 yards on the ground. That looked a little bit better. The defense looked like it did some things pretty okay. So Cal might have better than a bargain basement 3-9 team this season. Auburn is starting a quarterback that they didn't expect to have there, and Peyton Thorne from Michigan State. 59-14 over Massachusetts last week. Not exactly a real barometer for what they're capable of. He was 10 for 17, though, passing. 141 and a touchdown. They had a package there for Robbie Ashton, who was competing for the quarterback position as well at one point. A few rushes and a touchdown for him, a couple passes. Should be a competitive game that's enjoyable to watch. And both of these teams building up as teams that have struggled recently, but on an upward trajectory. So much like Oklahoma State, Arizona should be hopefully competitive, but maybe not the best quality football teams that you're watching a lot of moving forward. But just fun to have these in the late night slate from power conferences. Again, Arizona State hosting Oklahoma State, Cal hosting Auburn, USC hosting Stanford. That should be a splattering. Fresno hosting Eastern Washington, Oregon State hosting UC Davis. And then your late night is Hawaii hosting Albany. And that'll be like a midnight tip-off Eastern time. Hawaii might have a real quarterback there. And Braden Shager, he seems to have a decent arm and be able to make some decent reads and be okay. 700 yards through 2 games, 64% completion, 6 touchdowns, 2 picks, and makes right decisions. Now Vanderbilt and Stanford might combined have 6 wins this season. The defense is not awesome, but not horrible. I don't know what to do with Hawaii as far as forming a concrete opinion, but the Rainbow Warriors are not horrible, and they should hopefully pick up a win this upcoming Saturday. All right, finally, your categories for the week. Your must-watch, top-watch game is, of course, Texas at Alabama at 7 o'clock on ESPN. The trajectory for both of these teams could be dependent on this game, could be dependent on the outcome. They both have conference play to go, but what are the quarterbacks going to look like? What are the defenses going to look like? What are the offenses going to look like? What is Texas's offensive line going to look like? Still a lot of questions for both of these teams. We're not sure if they're both playoff teams. We're not sure if one of them's a playoff team. We're not sure if either are a playoff team. But this is the must-watch game, of course. It has been for years. Texas at Alabama. Audible. I put Kansas State hosting Troy on FS1 in the noon window on here. Again, that's a little bit thinner slate. It's possible Notre Dame houses NC State. Utah Baylor's a little boring. And Colorado, Nebraska, not sure about that one. Good, certainly. Interesting, certainly. But what are you going to flip over to then? How about check on Kansas State and Troy? See what's going on there. Is Troy giving them fits? Is Kansas State going to continue to roll to the top half of the Big 12? Got to remember my conferences now as we're fading further and further away from those next year. So my Audible game falls in the noon slot. My check-in game falls in the 3:30. Iowa and Iowa State. When you are watching Ole Miss and Tulane and Texas A&M Miami, don't forget to flip over and check on the Cyclones and the Hawkeyes. Cade McNamara's second game there. Is Iowa State looking any better? This could be a very boring slugfest. That's why it's not prime viewing. But it could be an interesting game as well between those two and their rivalry battle there. Your small screen starlet. Now, I mentioned Jacksonville State and Coastal Carolina playing an interesting game on ESPN Plus at 7 o'clock. If you don't have the Plus, this is cheating a bit, but Boise State hosting Central Florida, the new Big 12 member, on FS1. See what Boise's doing. And Central Florida, these still could be two really good ball clubs. And UCF could possibly surprise in the Big 12 and not be that bad of a team. They look pretty put together so far. And Boise State looking to rebound with Taylor Green at quarterback after their shelling at the hands of Washington last week. Next up, the underrated game. I have North Carolina and Appalachian State on the ACC network, 5:15. Such a great ball game last year. I think it'll be a great ball game this week. North Carolina's playing really well. Appalachian State looked pretty good. I think this will be another really good battle. I don't think North Carolina's necessarily going to blow them out of the water. I think this is a very good one. But man, I think there's stuff all over the board. Washington State at Wisconsin as well on ABC. Mississippi State, Arizona on the SEC network in the evening could also be on the docket as well. Maybe Virginia Tech, Purdue in the noon slate on ESPN too. Just, I think quite a few candidates here as far as underrated matchup. Well, there's a couple big ones looming. And finally, your late night snack. The best game to me is Auburn and Cal on ESPN at 10:30. Better than Arizona State and Oklahoma State. There might be a clear talent discrepancy there. Maybe not, but there's lots of choices, which is fun. You can still see Caleb Williams throw some touchdowns before he's pulled from the game if it's too much of a blowout. And, you can still see Oregon State and DJ Uiagalelei for a bit. But Auburn Cal should be competitive, and we could see if these teams are going anywhere based on how they play each other. So ESPN 10:30, Auburn and Cal is your late night snack. So thank you very much for tuning into the Michael Welch podcast. I do have my rankings and predictions for the NFL up on michaelwelch.com, spelled as the podcast name is. And we have the NFL coming up here, and we have college football coming up here, and it's going to be a good time. Thank you very much for listening. I'll talk with you later. Bye-bye.